Thank you very much for that elaborate and long introduction. I think it went longer than I intended to speak. So now I have to try and make up some stuff. But I'm very happy to be here today for many reasons. I always like speaking to students. They shape the future, and a politician like me who wants to be an agent of change relishes the chance to speak to students. But I also have a different reason. Both my father and my grandfather were very close to Kit. And from the inception days of Sishya, I think I've been aware and connected in some way. My family, like Salim, myself, and all Laurentian. So we have so many connections. But I was struck as I was sitting there by the contrast, because unexpectedly this morning I had to fly down to Madurai to inaugurate the free breakfast scheme of our government, of our Chief Minister, at one of the really kind of, what can I say, people with the lowest levels of income and opportunity, a government school that caters to them, what used to be called in the old days the Colour Reformation schools. I had not planned to go because in my constituency, we chose to pilot the scheme last year itself. And so 100% of the schools in my constituency have been getting free breakfast in September of 2022. And so I had not actually planned to go. But because all ministers and MLAs were expected to go, the last minute I got a call. I flew down on the 6:30 flight and flew back in the afternoon. But as I was sitting here, I was struck by the contrast. I've gone from one end of the spectrum where if the school doesn't feed the students, they may not get enough nutrition, to arguably one of the most elite schools in the capital city of our state. And it made me think, what is the role of the state in education? Of course, I think it varies a lot. As in any other field, the primary role of the state is to allocate resources efficiently, not end up spending too much on those who already have and spend as much as possible on those who don't. But I would say even more for somebody like me, the outcome is much more important than the intent. Of course, we all have good intent. What is the outcome? And in that sense, I would say for government schools, we should measure ourselves on the average outcome of the entire class or school. And really what the government can do best for elite schools like this one is just stay out of the way and allow you to achieve the aspirations of the school, of the parents, of the students without too much interference and let you use your resources the way you see best. But let me leave public policy aside for a second. Let me pick up on something that the Secretary started in his speech. How do you get future ready? I would say the demands of a good education should be constantly changing over time. One of the things I really liked in the US, where I lived for 20 years and got several of my degrees, was how strong the connection was between the real economy, the market, and the academic institutions. How quickly the academic institutions adapted to what was happening in the real economy in terms of demand for skills, for different types of niche expertise, and how quickly the system kind of self-corrected or adapted. Of course, we're trying to do some of that here, but we are a long ways behind because we are not inherently a data-driven society. The government nor any institution, neutral institution, actually is collecting enough information about the economy, about the needs, and connecting it back to the parents, to the children. Now we have a bit of a unique problem in another way, is that we have gone through that part of the development curve where the proportion of children going to college has increased exponentially. I often cite the statistic that when I graduated from REC Trichy, what is now called NIT Trichy, back in 1987, I think the state of Tamil Nadu produced about 4,000 engineers a year. Now it produces about 150,000 a year, or slightly more. How have we adapted to the needs for career guidance, for instructors, for specialists in this exponential growth? And have we really provided the support from the government for an ecosystem that allows for efficient allocation of people to subjects, to skills, to jobs, to the market? And I think that's an additional problem we've had in our government under our Chief Minister's leadership. We are starting to take some steps, but this is a problem I recognized back in 2016. In my maiden speech in the Assembly, I brought this up to the then ADMK government and the then Chief Minister, Ms. Jayalalitha, who tried to do some things about it as well. But the theme of this day here, technology, boon or bane, is also very interesting. And we are much more enlightened about it after the lockdown and COVID. At some level, technology is a great leveler. Technology in itself and more the internet or the connectedness of all the sources of knowledge that are publicly available. Effectively, we have made it possible for those with enough interest to get the equivalent of a PhD in physics, let's say, without ever having to go to school, if the transfer of knowledge was efficient, if it was friction-free, just because it exists on the screen. If I can acquire it by reading, then I don't actually need to do anything more than that. But that's even then only in theory, because the real question becomes, how many people have access? Is it universal? Is it universal at all speeds? Can some people only read and rich people have high-speed internet and can watch videos of people explaining nuclear physics, for example? And in the course of the pandemic, we discovered something even much more fundamental or rudimentary than that. Do they have a device on which we can actually broadcast a class or have people participate in a Zoom call or a Google Teams meet? And I think the answer is that while technology will continue to be an enabler for the poorest, for the least connected, governments must make tremendous efforts to make sure access is equitable. And after all of that, we must realize that there are serious limits to the notion of remote learning or learning without human interaction. In fact, we had the luxury of having commissioned a study before the government of Tamil Nadu, prior to our government, before we went into COVID, had a baseline study of the learning levels of various classes. And so once lockdown was lifted, we actually commissioned the same team, the JPAL, the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, to do a follow-up study and see how much impact the 2 years of lockdown had had. And not surprisingly, 2 years of lockdown had set people back 2 years in their basic benchmarks. Can you read to a 5th class level? Can you do math to a 8th class level? And so forth. So in effect, 100% of our efforts across cable TV, across Zoom calls, across remote learning, basically had no advancement at that level of education, at the youngest levels of education. So with the great insight and continuous insistence of our Global Economic Advisory Committee, in particular people like Dr. Raghuram Rajan, Esther Duflo, and John Drays, we designed a remedial education scheme called Illam Thedi Kalvi, where we didn't really bother about the content. We were not interested in trying to make up the learning per se. We wanted to inculcate the value of human interaction and the regularity of having to go to school or go to a place and intermingle both with other students and with somebody in a kind of teaching role. And again, we were pleasantly surprised at the resilience of young people, because in less than 6 months, we found steep recovery curves. And it matched our notion of social justice because the poorest of the families were more likely to send their children to these remedial education programs. Now, it took us probably 6 months to figure out how to design it right because it had to happen at every block. It had to happen with somebody who was well known in the community. Those people needed to be trained ahead of time. We had to arrange a government location for this to happen. So it was not a simple program, but it produced tremendous results. And I go back to the point why I'm saying that here is digital learning or online or technology can only do so much. There is no substitute. There is an irreplaceable value for actual human interaction both in between students and student to teachers. That's the limitations of a boon. What about the bane? In particular, I would say in Tamil Nadu, we're finding that the prevalence of online gaming, often including financial loss, but certainly addictive online gaming, as well as the negative consequences of social media, I think are definitely banes of the advancement of technology. But I think in some ways it is the parents and then the school and then online. The great luxury of a good school is that the values come from inside and not from seeing somebody else on the screen, particularly people who live in different cultures or different contexts. At least that's the way we'd like it to be. The Secretary also spoke about parents having a role to play. I would humbly suggest that parents can play much more impactful roles by setting examples rather than by trying to enforce or trying to restrict. These days, the technology has become so ubiquitous and so difficult to control or contain that enforcement of discipline is not really, I think, sustainable for any length of time. But setting examples works. You know, a lot of people, if you look, even those in the Bay Area where technology is first created in most cases, a lot of people themselves don't go online for social media, don't go online for gaming, and then make sure that their children don't have access to that. These are the people creating the platforms. I think it's eminently reasonable that most of us can learn from them. I want to talk about one other contrast that struck me when I was sitting there because of the mention of 13 years. By coincidence, I was in Ooty last weekend. I think I flew down Saturday, came back Sunday. And part of the program involved some students from my old school, the Lauderdale School, Lovedale, making a presentation about their efforts to convert about 15 or 18 acres of the 600 plus acres of the school back into shola and grassland away from the cash crops that the British colonial times had planted on those lands, wattle and eucalyptus and other things. And it occurred to me that when I went to school, I don't know, about 50 years ago now, I just assumed that these lands had been there forever and would always be there. It never was in the scope of my imagination that I had a responsibility to conserve or preserve or retain or return something to an original state. So whatever the demands of education and being future ready are, I am certain that this generation, because of necessity, will learn the notion of sustainability and being kind to the environment and trying to prevent a worsening of the climate change and volatile patterns we've already seen. And in that way, I think this generation will be much more enlightened with a much greater burden, but much more enlightened and much more socially conscious than people of my generation, maybe a couple of generations ago. With that, let me just wish all of you on this annual day, I wish all of you a year of great excitement and joy, of friendship, of laughter. I think you learn the most when you're having fun and when you don't take it too seriously. I know that some of you will be facing public exams and the seniors will be facing college admissions. But life is unpredictable. There's no guarantee of anything. Of course, you should work hard. Of course, you should try your best. But as I say often, no success is permanent. Every day is a new fight. No failure is not redeemable. You fail at this, you try at something else. So you fail today, you get up and try again. Things like sports, extracurricular activities really teach you that in vivid example every day if you play it. And I'll conclude with the personal example that I gave to the Lawrence School students when I was up in Ooty. The person who had helped organize the conference was a classmate of mine in Lovedale. And I think he had been vice head boy or some very senior post. And while I had been a good academic student, I don't think anybody would have called me particularly responsible. So I said to them, life is unpredictable. Don't stress too much. Have fun, because look at what happened to the very responsible boy. He's sitting there as one of the organizing committee members, and look at the irresponsible boy. I'm standing here as a minister. In fact, that portfolio minister I used to be for the development. So I'm not encouraging truancy, but I'm saying don't take things too seriously. Have fun, be yourselves, develop your character, your personality. Life will take its own course. You're already all very blessed, relatively speaking, and I'm sure you will have great futures ahead. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I wish you all the best.